In this Architecture Today webinar with programme partners MEDITE SmartPly, creating outside space to make the best of urban living. Coming up, Harriet Bourne, Director BBUK, Steve Jackson-Matthews, Director LUC, Head of Technical Affairs and Island Sales MEDITE SmartPly, David Murray, award-winning garden designer Sarah Eberly, and Ewan Oliver, Public Realm Development Manager, Lend-Lease. Your chair for this webinar, Architecture Today editor, Isabel Allen.
Hello and welcome. Coming up, Steve Jackson-Matthews is going to focus on the biodiversity crisis and talk us through some of the tools available to put biodiversity enhancement at the heart of design. David Murray is going to tell us how MEDITE Mtx has opened up new opportunities for the design of landscape in the public realm. Sarah Eberly, garden designer and RHS Chelsea Flower Show multiple gold medal winner, is going to talk us through the garden she designed for this year's show. And Ewan Oliver is going to explain how the landscape master plan at Southwark's Elephant Park has evolved to put people and nature at the development's heart. There will be a Q&A session with all 5 speakers at the end of the webinar, so please do submit questions for any of our panellists using the button on your screen. But first, Harriet Bourne from BBUK is going to talk about her approach to designing public spaces, focusing on projects by Procter & Matthews, AHMM and Michael Rich's Architects. Harriet.
I'm here to talk about landscape and how through landscape we can make urban living better. So really I wanted to start with Peter Breugel, one of my favourite artists, who paints urban scenes. Sometimes rather rough and ready, slightly Hogarthian scenes, but typically fairly cheerful, crowded scenes. And I think this is really what we want urban living to be, where people can meet each other, play with each other, talk to each other, work in the urban environment, and relax and play in the urban environment. And there are several, and I wanted to start with kind of negatives and what creates a bad space, and from looking at the bad spaces, how we can make these better. So starting off with streets, we really need them to be overlooked. We need them to be well lit. We need to make sure that there's adequate room for pedestrians and cyclists. So the very typically the cycle lanes that end either in a puddle or with a parked car or on the route to nowhere. Cars that don't have adequate room for parking, so that they take over the footway, which make it impossible for pedestrians, let alone people in wheelchairs or pushing buggies or with small children, to get past. Clear guidance on what with materials, so that you can pass through a public space just by seeing what's on the ground, which will help you navigate the space. So kind of clear, succinct materials used on the ground. And another thing within urban spaces is rubbish, and that needs to be made sure that there's adequate storage for it. It's managed properly, and it's put in the right places, so it's not dominating the streetscape. The other thing that's really important is places where people can collect, but I think particularly children, and within urban spaces, this is really important that it's accessible directly from houses, not just accessible, but overlooked and inviting and challenging and imaginative. So the top slide shows the kind of worst example of a play area where children have to cross a road to get there. It's really too small for them to run around. It's got a overflowing rubbish bin in it. It's got 2 benches, which is great for carers, but if there's 2 families there, they can't talk to each other, so there's no chance of any social interaction, except as I suppose the space is so small they could probably shout across it. And then the material, the play equipment is about as unimaginative as you can get. And then obviously the bottom left image is really not very inviting at all. I think if it was just mud, it would actually provide much more imaginative play than with the slide running through the mud. The bottom right-hand slide shows where they've probably spent twice as much money on the safety materials than they have on the play equipment. again, you can see that the flats do have windows overlooking it, but it looks like they're bathroom windows. So actually there's no way that the parents or carers can stand at the kitchen washing up, but the sink and look out to see and keep an eye on their children. The other thing is planting, which has been much research now undertaken to show that planting really can enhance people's lives, their well-being, their health. We need to make sure that if we're putting in trees, they can be managed properly and they are the right species for the space, as opposed to poplars, which is shown at the top right, which have all had to be topped because they're probably interfering with buildings and surfaces. We need to make sure that planting is not going to be barrier planting is not going to grow so that it blocks windows, like in the bottom right. We need to make sure it's protected so cars and people can't walk and trample all over it. And then the other thing with open space is it needs to be accessible. So this is a site in the bottom left that we're working on in Hackney at the moment. There is a section of the housing that connects to the local shops that could be opened up and provide a really nice urban space for residents, immediate residents and more local residents to meet on, but it's been fenced off, so it's completely inaccessible to anybody. So what we really want from urban spaces is places that are sociable, places where you can meet your neighbours, spaces where children can play safely and imaginatively out in the public realm, and inclusive, so that actually there's provision for all ages to play and meet and relax within the open space. And we also, on top of that, need them to be biodiverse, fully accessible, and sociable. So I'm just looking at a couple of schemes that we've completed. The first one was one of the first large housing schemes that we did, working with Proctor Matthews Architects on the southern fringe of Cambridge. This was an extension to Cambridge City. It was the phase one of what is now very, very nearly complete, around 2,500 new homes. We worked on about 5 plots with 4 different architects across the phases of this. But this was plot 1, so it was kind of really key because it was the gateway into the site. It was the first site to be completed, and it was what we were working around the enormous existing roundabout, which is bang in the middle of the site. So really we needed to find a way of creating kind of focus for the site without it being too focused on the road. So we planted bosques or squares, tightly, formally spaced trees around this roundabout, and created what we referred to as the Great Court, because it was exactly the same size as the Great Court in Cambridge University. This was set back from the road. On the original master plan, there was a play area sited immediately northwest of the roundabout. This we agreed to move within the site, and we actually spread the play across the site into a series of play routes, which followed the pedestrian routes through from east to west across the site, so that this was spread out rather than concentrating it on a main road. The trees helped to shelter the homes around the road, and then as you progressed back through the site to an existing shelter belt, the kind of formality of the layout of both the houses and the landscape started to break down. So it became more informal and more rural as you moved across the site. So this is the completed bosque or the Great Court. So there was a bull's court set underneath the trees, and a kind of multi-age play was proposed along this area. There were mass plantings of cornus in various different colours. Cornus, which has got brightly coloured winter stems, in different colours. So we had reds and yellows, so three different species of cornus, and they were underplanted with a contrast single species of flowers. So although they were mass plantings of a single species, they were varied across the whole space in order to create variety and a bit more biodiversity. We then had these routes which were pedestrian routes that followed east to west through the sites from the kind of tree belt through to the Great Court and the centre of the site. Some of these were designed just as pedestrians with kind of wide planted areas on either side. Others were which were slightly wider, were designed to have play set amongst them. And then there were also, and all the roads were quite narrow, so were able to prioritise pedestrians and cycles through the site. And I think this probably is an architectural practice coming for a study visit. We've had quite a few study visits across the site. And then the other thing, that because the roads were very narrow, we had a really good highways engineer from Cambridge City Council working with us, and we were allowed to have the actual carriageway width at minimum widths of 2.75, and then the parking, which was in a contrasting colour, off there. So it was actually impossible for anybody to park on the road because it was just nobody could get past them. So they felt very much like, they really had a feel of pedestrian roads. And actually, when I went to visit the site after a couple of years, I went by car, and driving around, it was kind of almost difficult to work out which roads I could be on, until I remembered, of course, we could be on all of the roads as we designed it. But actually, even as the designer, it kind of felt as if we shouldn't be driving, we should be walking or cycling down the routes. So the next project I wanted to talk about is very much an urban project. It was White Collar Factory which is just to the south of Old Street roundabout. We worked with AHMM on this. It was creating a little piece of public realm off the roundabout, which at the time was it's now being redeveloped, but at the time was very harsh, very traffic dominated, very few places to stop and rest, so it created this little oasis from the traffic. It also created a new pedestrian route from Old Street through to Featherstone Street, and then these little pockets of kind of seating areas which were quite private, quite small, with movable tables and chairs, and then a piece of lawn for people to gather, and then spin out for some of the restaurants on the ground floor. This was planted almost entirely with native planting. The trees were set out in order to attenuate the kind of wind from the tower block, and the seats, the planted areas were set out so that the top of the planter was at the right height for a seat. So they were quite kind of multifunctional spaces. The planting was all surrounded with box hedging, which is a kind of low evergreen native hedge. And so that increased the biodiversity, or helped to add to the kind of ecology and biodiversity of the site. And finally, I wanted to talk about Goldsmith Street, which we worked on with Mikhail Riches in Norwich. It was 100% passive house, 100% social rent. And it was set out along two L-shaped, upside down L-shaped vehicle roads, with a pedestrian route running north to south through the centre of the site. There was two small pockets of existing open space to the kind of south and to the northeast of the site, and then we created these two pieces of kind of shared open spaces which connected to people's private back gardens. Everybody was provided with a front garden on the south, if they were south facing homes. So the north facing homes went open straight onto the pavement. The south facing homes had a front garden, which was big enough to have a small kind of cafe table and chairs, big enough to be kind of occupied, so they became really quite sociable front spaces. And what I really enjoyed about going back on kind of site visits and kind of inspections once the houses were occupied was the level of engagement that people had to actually start to make these front gardens their own. So they were all planted, which is slightly unusual to be planting private spaces for us as landscape architects. We usually only work in the public realm. So they were all planted with kind of robust evergreen, some perennial shrubs. But some of these were bolstered with other plants. They put in their own gnomes. They added hanging baskets to the porches, and often when we went back, unfortunately I haven't got a photograph of it, there were people sitting out there. People had brought their own tables or chairs out there, and they were using them kind of like stoops, and so they were able to kind of interact and communicate with neighbours. To the rear of the houses, they all had back gardens, slightly varying in size, and then there was this what we called the ginnel at the back, which was planted with robust low evergreen and perennials, and then trees and small benches, and then a couple of them had tables as well, so people could sit out and picnic together. And the idea here was that the gates could be opened, the back garden gates could be opened, children could go out safely. There were gates into the public realm. These have key numbered fob locks on them, so they're only accessible by the people that live there. And these were really well used and really successful for neighbours. So people within kind of weeks of people moving in, they'd already met their neighbours through the children playing and through them being able to meet within these communal spaces. Whilst they were also had decent sized rear gardens, which obviously were their private spaces. And then on top of that, connecting to the ginnels were the kind of incidental public spaces. So these were slightly wider, lawned spaces with small play, which created this play trail again through the estate. A small number of benches as well, and these. So the bin stores were hidden behind the grills here, and they were all overlooked by the houses going onto them and by the houses to the north and south. So there were front doors opening out onto these spaces, so they weren't blind to the rest of the site. And then there was the area that was an existing space, open space to the northeast of the site. We made the main kind of communal play area for under fives. So the idea here was that this area could be used by the new residents at Goldsmith Street, but could also start to be used by the existing residents that lived to further north and east of the site, where there are kind of two-storey existing homes there. So we envisaged this as being the kind of glue that started to bring people from the wider area into Goldsmith Street, and so that the new homes really started to kind of bed themselves into the wider context.
And if you do have any questions for Harriet, please do submit them using the button on your screen. Next up, we're going to hear from Steve Jackson-Matthews of LUC, who's going to talk to us about the measures we can take to put biodiversity at the heart of design. Steve.
Hi there, and thanks very much for the introduction. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with LUC's work, but for those who haven't heard of us before, LUC is a multidisciplinary environmental consultancy. We specialise in bringing together landscape architects, planners, ecologists and geospatial experts to deliver sustainable landscape-led master plans for projects right across the UK and Ireland. Recently, we've collaborated on a really wide range of high-profile projects that all seek to balance the needs of growing communities with wider wellbeing, environmental and sustainability requirements. Some of our highlights include Bristol Zoo Gardens with Penwar Prasad, which you may have seen in the BBC News recently. Edinburgh's Granton Waterfront Development Framework with Collective Architecture is a particular favourite of mine. The University of Northampton's exciting new waterside campus, which I expect some of you will have visited. It's been highly promoted. And then a project that LUC is exceptionally proud of, the multi-award winning Clepits Inner City Nature Reserve in Glasgow. You may have heard of this project too. Just less than a kilometre from the city centre, the Glasgow Canal Corridor has significant potential to contribute to the regeneration of disconnected and disadvantaged communities in North Glasgow. The underlying principle of LUC's master plan for the project was to improve the health and well-being of local communities through facilitating access to improved green spaces while responding to heritage, cultural and ecological sensitivities, of which there were many. LUC worked with Scottish Canals and partners, including LDN Architects, to deliver a very ambitious vision. And the project construction phase just finished a few months ago, and we're delighted to be welcoming hundreds of visitors to Clepits. What all of these projects had in common was a commitment to multidisciplinary working to deliver sustainable landscape-led master plans that worked really, really hard on multiple levels. However, you'll have noticed that I'm not a landscape architect, and today I don't propose to talk to you about LUC's wider approach to landscape-led master planning. Instead, I want to talk to you about a very specific and increasingly important component of our design process. We obviously often speak of the dual climate and biodiversity crisis. The need to respond to these crises is well established, and it's encouraging and energising to see our industries stepping up to that challenge. The architects I work with regularly are increasingly putting climate resilience at the centre of their design proposals. And interestingly, a quick look through Architecture Today's back catalogue of events really demonstrates that your profession is also collaborating and innovating in response to that challenge. While we focus on the climate crisis, however, our collective response to the biodiversity component of the crisis still has a little way to go. And forgive me for taking a slightly dark turn for a moment, but let me just highlight the current state of play in the UK using data from the Natural History Museum's Biodiversity Intactness Index. And biodiversity literally just means biological diversity, or the richness and diversity in species and habitat assemblages. So let me just make some of these points. In the UK, we've lost almost 50% of our natural biodiversity. 13% of that has been lost just since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago. That means the UK has lost more of its biodiversity than any other G7 nation. And globally, the UK is in the bottom 10%. That's the bottom 10% of nations in terms of biodiversity intactness. Ultimately, it's a pretty damning situation for us to be in. But why does that matter? Well, beyond the intrinsic value of biodiversity, the UK's flora and fauna controls every single one of humanity's life support systems. Pollination for crops, surface temperature regulation, surface water storage, ecosystem services, as they're called, are essential to humanity's ability to live on Earth. Additionally, if we learned anything from the pandemic, it's that access to nature and biodiversity are essential for good mental health and well-being. And the resultant loss of biodiversity is particularly keenly felt in the urban environment, where our biodiversity is at its very poorest. But why on earth am I ruining your day with tales of the apocalypse? Well, because finally, as legislation and planning policy respond to the biodiversity crisis, the value of biodiversity is being increasingly recognised in all aspects of public life, including the development, planning and management world in which we all work. I expect you're familiar with the 25-year Environment Plan and the Environment Act, which will underpin its delivery. If you're not, the 25-year plan, published in 2018, is a riveting read, and I suggest you Google it on the UK government's website. It's a super ambitious plan, and it takes a strategic approach to the restoration of biodiversity at a national scale. There's a lot to be excited about. But what does it mean for your work and the work that I deliver as an ecological consultant? Well, the Environment Act places new responsibilities on development projects. Accountability for our impact on the natural environment has never been clearer, and the projects you and I work on ultimately need to step up a gear. Now, the contents and reach of the plan and the acts are subject for another presentation, but suffice to say that things are really changing, and it's essential that we as design teams and advisors help our clients realise sustainable development that really embraces the opportunity for biodiversity protection and enhancement. As urban designers, the urgency is even greater if we're to help people in the urban environment reconnect with nature and the myriad benefits it provides. So how do we do it? How do we step up to the challenge? And it's a daunting challenge. Well, there are plenty of tools available to us right now that help us bring biodiversity enhancement deeper into the design process. Unless you spent the past few years living in a cave, which you might well have chosen to do during the pandemic, you'll already be completely saturated with biodiversity net gain. Emerging directly from the Environment Act, from November 2023, all developments in England, with very few exceptions, will be required to demonstrate they can achieve a 10% net gain in biodiversity. The devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are still exploring their options, but are likely to follow a similar format in the next year or so. The process of BNG is a complex one involving way more spreadsheets than ecologists generally care for, but it's a very powerful tool that helps our clients and design partners demonstrate real benefits for biodiversity. The urban greening factor is another powerful tool for use in London, coming as it does from the London Plan. It allows designers to demonstrate increases in a development's proposed green space. It's important to note, however, that while the UGF places greater emphasis on semi-natural habitats, it's ultimately all about green space, whether that green space is of value to biodiversity or not. And importantly, not all green space is of value to biodiversity. Then the Building with Nature scheme, which I expect some of your practices have explored in depth, sets out a series of science-backed technical standards that allow design teams to develop green infrastructure that places biodiversity at its heart. Projects can apply for a Building with Nature Design Award as a means of demonstrating their credentials. And then, of course, there's trusty old BREEAM, the original maths-heavy approach to nature conservation. It too still has its value if it's used properly and genuinely. But if you'll let me, I just want to linger on biodiversity net gain for a moment. I'm sure some of you have worked with it already and are seeing the resultant step change in how we consider development's impact on biodiversity. It's no overstatement to say that it has the potential to revolutionise our urban landscapes in the near future, not least because developers are tied into habitat protection and enhancement for a 30-year period from completion. But BNG is new, and like all new things, its boundaries are being tested and pushed, so it's useful to just highlight some key principles. Ultimately, the mitigation hierarchy still applies. We'll still be expected to avoid impacts and protect sensitive features before creating new or replacement features. Similarly, we'll be expected to explore options to achieve gains on-site before using options to deliver compensation off-site. We don't have carte blanche to clear vegetation from sites and replace the biodiversity lost somewhere else in the wider landscape. There are so many seminars and workshops on biodiversity net gain and the other tools I've mentioned, and I'd really encourage you to spend some time getting to know them. If used properly and genuinely, they can help us achieve something really great. And I say genuinely because all of these, or most of these tools, are metric-based, and like all metric-based tools, they can be manipulated. There are lots of examples of BNG calculations jumping from a net loss of 10% to a net gain of 40% simply by altering a single habitat type in the very complex DEFRA calculator. It is so important that we adopt these tools with integrity if we're to see the change that we really need. LUC has been adopting these tools in a project context for quite a while now, and it's been a useful exercise in understanding how and when they should be used. Again, it's not an overstatement to say that the role of professional ecologists in the design project has changed enormously over the past year or two. While we've been getting used to these new approaches, it's been really important to recognise that the way our industry has always done things hasn't solved the biodiversity crisis. We need to be open to a whole new approach if we're to deliver meaningful change. On this slide, I've summarised a few things from our experience, but I'd ask you to consider these points as a personal challenge when you leave today's session and go back to your desks. Collaboration is absolutely crucial. Gone are the days when ecologists would prepare protected species surveys and move on to the next project without a backward glance. We need to work together from concept stage to realise the biodiversity benefits we need. This is particularly important when considering BNG, as each step of the process has to be carefully considered and metrics used in an iterative way to demonstrate design evolution. Biodiversity is just one of the crises that we're all trying to respond to. In our work, we're addressing the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, and the mental health and wellbeing crisis. Priority conflicts will arise, and it's important that we recognise them and bring them to the table for discussion, particularly when we're asking green space to achieve too much. And linked to that point, we must avoid well-intentioned greenwash. We must try not to exaggerate the benefits of biodiversity interventions. Tree planting isn't woodland creation. Green space, primarily allocated to recreational use, isn't a nature reserve. Installing a few bat boxes won't turn the tide on biodiversity loss, and that's okay. There's balance to be found, but we have to bring it to the table and discuss it as a design team. And finally, we must educate ourselves, our colleagues, our clients, and our project stakeholders. We've a long way to go to recover biodiversity loss in the UK, but we're on the right track. Development project design teams have a huge contribution to make, and we must make sure we're all travelling at the same pace and in the same direction. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Our next speaker is David Murray from MEDITE SmartPly, and David's going to talk about a new material, MTX, and show us some extraordinary projects that demonstrate its potential to transform the public realm. David.
I'm going to attempt to illustrate how one game-changing, innovative, low-carbon wood product called MEDITE Trichoya Extreme, or MTX for short, is quite literally transforming the way garden designers and landscape architects are thinking about designing open spaces. Now, you're all familiar with the great versatility and design freedom that is afforded by a product called MDF. But the problem with MDF is it can't be used outside, or can it? The reason many timbers can't be used outside is because they're not inherently durable. And I really like this timber durability chart because it shows all of the timbers that we know and love, and they fit into one of 5 durability classes, ranging from non-durable all the way over to very durable. And in the course of this presentation, I'm going to explain how we take and modify the properties of a non-durable softwood and transform that into a product that behaves like a hardwood, such as teak. So here's the science bit. Well, as we know, trees, when they grow, they absorb huge quantities of water. About 50% of a tree is made up of water. And incidentally, the other half of the dry mass of wood is carbon. So that's important from a climate protection point of view in terms of carbon sequestration. So if we look at the molecular structure of timber, we can see that there are 2 types of water in a tree. There's free water and bound water. Free water occupies the wood cell, or the void in the wood cell. And this is quite easily dried off when you kiln dry timber. The second type is bound water. This is more complicated because it gets bound up deep within the cell wall of the timber. And it's this bound water that changes the wood chemistry, that identifies the wood chemistry between a hardwood and a softwood. I'm going to explain a little bit about the wood chemistry here. A softwood is typically made up, the cell wall here in a softwood is typically made up of hydroxyl group, which absorb water. And in the case of a hardwood, the cell wall is predominantly made up of acetyl groups, which don't absorb water. So that's the key difference between a hardwood and a softwood. So if we look at wood modification by acetylation, many of you have already experienced this. If you cheated at conkers in the schoolyard when you were young, you'll know that soaking the conkers in vinegar basically changed the structure, and it made the conkers extremely hard and durable. And what that did is the vinegar displaced the moisture within the conker, which gave it a very hard, durable shell. So you were a champion conker player. Well, acetylating wood is a very similar process, although it's slightly more complicated at large commercial scale. So if we look at, first of all, the fast-growing softwoods, typically they grow within 30 to 40 years or less. They're commercially grown worldwide. They're very abundant, but they're not durable, unlike hardwoods. So examples would be pine and spruce. And here, as I mentioned, the wood chemistry is made up of mainly hydroxyl groups, and this causes the wood to shrink and swell. In the case of hardwoods, then, we look at, these are slow growing, and they are mainly in tropical climates. They're more durable than softwoods, but they're less available than softwoods. Examples would be teak, iroko, and so on. And these trees have less hydroxyl groups, which means they have less shrinkage and swelling. So if we look at modifying a slow-growing, a fast-growing softwood into a slow-growing softwood by the method of acetylation, in normal softwood, you have movement or shrinking and swelling typically across the grain. And you also have a food source for insects, wood-boring insects to eat. When we acetylate softwood, there's virtually no shrinking or swelling, and the acetylation, the vinegary smell, I guess, causes the insects to move away, and they're not interested in the wood anymore. And as well as that, because you've changed the structure of the wood, insects don't want to eat the food source anymore. So essentially what we've done is we have changed the wood chemistry from hydroxyl groups, which again are the water absorbing groups, and we've changed those into acetyl groups, which don't absorb water, changing it from almost from a softwood into a hardwood. This makes modified wood more durable than all hardwood and softwood timbers and replaces the need to harvest endangered tropical hardwood forests. So here we look at dimensional stability. We have a block of MTX on the left and a block of MDF on the right. And all this does is show that the MTX is 6 times more resistant to thickness swell than the MDF. Dimensional instability in practice. Well, if you use MDF to make a set of garden doors, this is typically what's going to happen. The wood will expand and contract with moisture and the paint will go with it. In the case of the shop sign, well, the plywood has delaminated and completely rotted away. So really the coating performance is the least of your worries in that case. So very briefly, if you look at the performance benefits of MTX or Metatrichoic Extreme, it's a very durable, long-lasting material with a 50-year warranty above ground and 25 years warranty in ground. It is extremely dimensionally stable. And for the purposes of today, I want to really show how much design freedom is afforded to designers and architects with the material in outdoor conditions. The maintenance costs are a lot lower because the coatings, the wood is durable and the coatings last longer. I'll come back to sustainability shortly. Because we've modified the cellular structure of the wood, it is now resistant to fungal decay and wood-boring insects, and it has a design service life of 60 years. So looking at the coating performance, I always say that a coating is only as good as the substrate that it's applied to. And in this case, you can see a really good hydrophobic example here of a high performance coating on MTX. We've worked with all the main coating manufacturers who provide extended coating warranties with their products for up to 15 years on MTX. Looking at sustainability is really key and very important topic at the moment, obviously. Sustainable wood is only sustainable if it comes from well-managed forests, well-managed in the growing and the managing of the forests and the harvesting of those forests, and that those forests are constantly replenished and that there's no damage to existing environments and local flora and fauna. And the best way to demonstrate that is through FSC certification, which the product is FSC certified. It has no negative environmental impact, and that's obviously subject to whatever coatings are placed on the board. And it can also be recycled at the end of life. And again, that's subject to the end of life considerations for the coatings or laminates that may be applied to the board. There are so many examples of MTX used in outside conditions, ranging from fascias and soffits here to outdoor decorations on a gingerbread hotel, to beach seating, to front doors in houses, to shop fronts, and to cladding and facades. But really what I want to do is focus on those examples where outdoor spaces have literally been transformed using the product. In the interest of time, I am not going to credit every photograph and name every designer. What I will say is that all of these case studies are available on our website, and you can read them at your leisure. Here we see some really terrific examples of sculptures using MTX. The picture on the left is a giant kangaroo, a 6-meter tall kangaroo outside a mother and newborn baby hospital in the Netherlands, which provides a warm and fun focal point to focus children's attentions on. The middle photograph really demonstrates how digitization allows really intricate designs to be formed with MTX. And the picture on the right is by Alex Devereaux, and he likes to give people the wow factor and make people think that they're looking at the real thing. And in this case, I think he's achieved that because that's actually made of MTX, not the original steel structure of a railway. Here we see some bespoke art installations from Davichi Developments in London, and you can see here the versatility that MTX affords when combined with CNC technology. In this example, we have a laminated MTX chair at Chester Zoo, which is an interactive chair. So you sit down and you watch the animals doing whatever they're doing, and you listen to all about them on the speakers on the side of the chair. And various other examples here are ranging from very simple tabletops to benches to laminated furniture. And this example on the bottom right is a rooftop garden project in London where MTX was used as the benches. This one is quite close to our hearts in Smartply. It's located in Waterford, very close to our Smartply mill. And here the architects and engineers wanted to a structural solution for a mirrored top to this canopy. So the solution was Smartply OSB and MEDITE MTX, which are basically formed the substrate of a toughened laminated mirrored glass finish. So what this has done is has transformed this, I suppose, once drab and dreary disused market area into a bustling centre, urban centre surrounded by lively bars and restaurants, and it's used for a variety of reasons such as performing arts, music venues, busking, and so on. In this example, we see some garden art where the artist wanted to preserve 6 of her original paintings for 50 years or more in a children's hospital in Inverness, including a Highland cow and the Loch Ness Monster. And the result was that the MTX was easier to paint and a lot lighter than the alternative, which was slate. MEDITE Smartply commissioned 6 insect hotels to be built. There are 2, one each in our manufacturing plants and one in our commercial centre in London. And this was done as part of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which is aimed at encouraging biodiversity and particularly focusing on Ireland's dwindling bee population. And the remaining 3 insect hotels were donated to local schools to promote about education about biodiversity and bee populations. There are so many examples about MTX used in planters. Here are 2. The one on the left is Hammersmith Station, where charred wood was used in these twisted planter boxes, and the charred wood wasn't durable enough to cope with the in-ground conditions, so the inside of the boxes are lined with MTX in that case. On the right, we see hexagonal planters, which were used to transform a regenerated area at London Bridge. Here we see an example of outdoor kitchens and barbecue areas. So it just shows the versatility of MDF. It can be machined and painted in exactly the same way as you would do with your indoor kitchen. This is an example of lantern-style lighting in a redwood forest canopy walkway in Rotorua in New Zealand, chosen for its tin MDF, chosen for its ease of machinability and also ability to cope with the harsh environment in the treetops. This is a great example, another example of a community project where these happy-looking guys are pointing the way for children cycling to and from school in a safe way, and it also promotes kids to be more active. And closer to home then, this is the electric railway sign, which is the home of the Manx Electric Railway in Douglas in the Isle of Man. And you can see this, the original sign had rotted away after 30 years. It was made with marine plywood. And you can see that the hostile environment of the coastal location really, I suppose, is an example of the great performance of a product like MTX. Staying with extreme environments, these beach huts were lined and cladded with a product called SAM Trimax, which is made from an MTX substrate. In this case, the product is in a double shiplap formation, which has been machined and then painted to the RAL color of the client's choice. On the left here, we see a bridge or walkway in the Eden project, which I believe is linking 2 parts of the largest indoor rainforest in the world. And in this case, the non-slip grip shore products were machined into MTX and the coating applied over the whole surface. On the right-hand side, we see a bridge that was linking a school in Oxford with their playing pitches. And in this case, they needed a really non-slip product for walking across in studded football boots. So it's a coarse aggregate that's painted onto the MTX substrate. And finally, then we look at, I think, a great example of a contemporary cladding on a floating houseboat, again in the Netherlands. And in this case, the product was chosen for its durability and longevity, particularly its coating performance, ease of coloring, and the coating longevity, which they wanted, lower maintenance for the coating. So again, it's a great example of a contemporary cladding. In this case, I think it was a fish scale. The cladding was installed in a fish scale design. So thank you for listening. I have intentionally omitted one really great example of MTX used in the Chelsea Flower Show this year. But Sarah Eberle is coming up next, and I'm going to let her explain that. It will quite literally blow your mind.
Thank you, David. And now, as David has flagged up, garden designer Sarah Eberle is going to show us her design for the MEDITE Smart Ply Building the Future Garden at this year's Chelsea Flower Show. Sarah.
Hi everybody, fantastic to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about the MEDITE Smart Ply Building the Future Garden at RHS Chelsea Flower Show. I was first approached by MEDITE for this really exciting project, and I guess my first response was one of excitement. I think I'm quite well known for having a great deal of interest in sustainability, and the fact that we're in climate crisis, etc. All those problems, environmental issues that we're so aware of at the moment. I guess my initial challenge was to take what is essentially a very two-dimensional flat board material and make it something exciting and really very, very three-dimensional. And for any of you who saw any of the coverage or indeed even went to Chelsea, you know that this final building, this grotto that we exhibited was really quite large, some 6 meters in height, 5 meters at the back, 3 meters at the front. So a lot of volume to this structure. So first of all, I had to really learn about the material and really have confidence in it. And certainly that came very quickly. And it's very obvious that it's guaranteed for 50 years for use outside, 25 years below ground. And it's very resistant to fungal decay. It's got enhanced stability, which means you can do many things with it. And it's absolutely perfect for coating. So the next thing I had to do was to really consider the big idea. Every garden has got a story to tell. So leading that is, of course, sustainability, and the fact that this is an innovative new building material that has an important role to play in the future. But I also needed it to have some wow factor to actually make people stop in their tracks and really have a look. So really I was looking at showcasing products with particular reference to MEDITE Tricoya Extreme, which we call MTX, but also alongside Smart Ply, Site Protect Plus and Strong Deck. So in terms of inspiration for this, very much forest edge. We're talking about this being a forest material made from waste product within forests. And I'm hugely inspired by the architecture of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of sense of the mighty and the steel, and everything felt really, really strong. But also the landscape ideal, the picturesque English landscape and the Victorian Gothic grottos that one would see around in parks and landscapes. So that kind of came to me as, how do I put that all together? So the idea of actually creating a large, modern, contemporary, sustainable grotto feature in a landscape was very exciting. It's resistant below ground, so there had to be water involved. So again, a cascade of water coming off the roof. For the actual building to be disappearing into the surrounding pond, stream, whatever we like to call it. So I'm just going to run you through some of the process we went through. And here we are on site. The basic steel structure from which everything is hung on is there. And you can see here, I put a tree on the top, a big, heavy tree. And here we use Strong Deck. That's a lot of tree to put on a single board. And you can see with the picture on the right there that the scale of that tree against our foreman there sitting on the root ball. So there's the final tree, very impressive, sitting in its Strong Deck pot, if you like. We then started to fit the main elements of this kind of rock fissure that was to be planted up to this steel frame. And actually, we could do this without cranes, but it's a lot easier at Chelsea to be able to use machinery in this way. So on the left there, you'll see those are the chutes of water, the chutes for the water, which is inspired by RSJs, great big steel elements that the water, as you can see on the right, finally crashes over into the pond below. And those fissures there being inspired by this vertical rock face that I actually had seen on a beach in Cornwall, and seeing the way the plants actually grow naturally out of those fissures. That was the feel that I wanted to create. And on the right here, you can see where we've planted this up. And the material here coping with this interaction with water and with the plant material itself. Again, the back, very dramatic, the rear of the building here. I had a wonderful planting team who came in and spent a lot of time up ladders, which is, I have to say, not for the faint-hearted and not for me. But this beautiful effect here of the play of the plant material against the MTX. A shot on the left, you can see this kind of sense of the romantic ideal, this English picturesque landscape. It's something that you would walk in the woods and come across. If only there was more of it to come across. But there are some beautiful landscapes. I mean, one great inspiration would be Star Head. And actually, I have to say that one of the delights of doing this garden was the fact that really the only limitation of what you can do with this material is your imagination. And that's what I wanted to show off, to inspire people to take this new building material forward in a way that was new and exciting. And you can see here how the material on the left actually disappears into the lake, so that it can sit there. It's quite resistant to that. It's quite happy in that situation. And that's, how many materials can you do that with? And on the right here, we had a wonderful pair of sculptors, Alex Devereaux and his wife Emma, who were the main key elements in how we put this together and the finishes on the building. So on the right there, you see a section of a sculpture they made. Again, this fooled everybody. Everybody thought this was steel. And in fact, we had a great deal of fun because, we had two men carrying this across the showground, and everybody was utterly floored by the fact that, how could two men carry this steel structure? You can see here now, in terms of what we used, you can see on the left the boundary material, which is the site smart boarding, which we just used as a neutral background, but actually it's normally used for, the site protectors used for, usually for instance, like construction site hoardings. But fantastic material, takes coating. So we painted this, then we did various finishes on it. So we had a lot of people doing different finishes, and that's lovely because this is a material you can make it do whatever you want it to do, really, which I think is of great interest to many people, and it makes it. I mean, even sculptors, garden designers, architects, all a sort of no end of creatives who could use this material. And we used it also for the edging of the pond, all the copings. So pretty much everything in this garden was created from these sustainable materials. I had to show a sort of long shot here. I actually was missing photographs of sort of the whole thing, because when I'm there building the garden, I get incredibly focused on the detail. So I start looking at shots that are going to be the most impactful, and sometimes I miss the wider view. But this is something that I particularly found so exciting, was the inside of the building. And now this wasn't easy. This took a long time to think through with Alex and Emma as how was this going to look. And for me, actually, this was probably one of the most exciting parts of it. It was cathedral-like in its being in there. The way the light would come through the cracks between the sheets of material, some of the plant material would come through, and then mocking up, this is not that great big cross member, that's MTX, it's not steel. And it created this chair below, which you can just see, I think, in one of these previous pictures on the left there, with the cushions, creating seating places for people within the garden. So again, so adaptable. I mean, there were people who spent a great deal of time in this building, and they were absolutely convinced that it's steel. I actually, to be honest, nearly convinced myself at times. And it just shows the adaptability of this material in a very, very creative way. Well, I hope a very, very creative way. And these coatings, so this was done by artists. So, that's their trick of their trade. We also had some artists from the Royal Opera House who set designers who were working on this. So their skill in applying these coatings, but he accepted all of them. There's a whole range of finishes and paints and applications that went into there, and this material just tolerates everything that you throw at it. So I think from this, I would like to say, it got, first of all, I must say, for anybody who doesn't know, it got a gold medal, and absolutely thrilled about it. I believe it went down very well with the public from its wow factor. But for me, the most important thing is from this garden is really, in a very visually exciting way, showing people some of the creative possibilities with these materials. You have to say that the future looks bright. But it's not only for those projects where there's something extraordinary, something entirely different, but think back to the ordinary, fences, gates, and basic furniture, as well as exciting sculpture and shall we say more specialised material. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed seeing that.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. So now we're going to hear from our final speaker, Lend-Lease's Ewan Oliver, who's going to talk us through the evolution of the landscape master plan of Elephant Park in Southwark. Ewan, over to you.
So I've been involved at Elephant Park for 7.5 years now as Public Realm Development Manager. I'm a chartered landscape architect, and I've been in the landscape industry for about 25 years across the public and private sectors. And I'm here today to tell you a little bit about how the landscape master plan at Elephant Park has evolved over the years, and how the team adopted a people and nature first approach to unlocking the value of the public realm. And it's true to say that we've been on a mission to try and create the most inclusive and welcoming series of public realm spaces that we could. This approach has really started to pay off. When you take a stroll down Ash Avenue or Sayre Street with their independent shopping shops, cafes and restaurants, or sit under a tree in the park watching people go by, you get a real sense of an urban oasis where people can thrive. But it's been quite a journey getting here, and we certainly didn't know all the answers when we set out. We've learnt a great many lessons along the way, and I want to share some of what we've learned with you today. Elephant Park is located in the London Borough of Southwark, about a 20-minute walk south of the River Thames. And this is what the landscape master plan will look like in 2026 when we've finished the last plot and delivered the last bit of public realm. It incorporates roughly 47% of the total area as public realm, and the public realm is made up of the park in the centre, which is will be roughly a hectare when it's completed, the surrounding streets, a civic square, and a number of smaller pocket parks. By the end of this month, we'll have completed about 75% of the total public realm, which will be handed over and fully accessible to the public, which will further open up connections through the site and link the town centre with the neighbourhood of East Walworth. But I want to start this story of evolution with the original landscape master plan. After a rigorous selection process, Lend-Lease became the joint regen partners of Southwark Council, and outline planning permissions for the demolition of the Haygate estate and the development of the new master plan were granted in 2013. We appointed Grant Associates as landscape architects, and this is the consented landscape master plan. It's a good master plan. It addresses all of Lend-Lease's planning obligations, including the provision of the 50% public realm that I just spoke about, retains a good quantum of the most valuable trees, which were of key importance at planning. It also makes good connections with the surrounding green infrastructure. However, our ambition as we move forward with the detailed design of the landscape has increased and increased, and along with it, there's a growing understanding, of course, of the issues of climate change and the real need to make our cities resilient. So about 4 years ago, we started to test aspects of the master plan and to truly start putting people and nature at the centre of our decision making. To help illustrate some of the big changes that we've made, I've selected a few examples of the big moves that we made, and I'll go into a bit more detail about how we and our design team went about it. So the original plan was to have a two-way road running along the edge of the park. You can see with the orange dotted line here. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought about how wrong it would be to have a busy road right next to the park. All the issues of air pollution and noise, of course. How could we make this park a more livable space, a greener and healthier place? And how could we deliver a place that fostered connections between people? So, simple. We got rid of the road. We serviced the two plots to the north of the park, off the New Kent Road. I say simple, but of course it wasn't simple, not in the slightest, in fact. There were long, protracted discussions with Transport for London, and at one point it was suggested that a large mature tree on the edge of the road was felled to improve sightlines, and we said we simply couldn't have this, so we moved the curb line along a whole section of the road to accommodate it. So we got rid of the road, and Ash Avenue, as we call it now, was now a pedestrian and cycle-friendly environment, generous retail spill out, etc. The park had a better connection with the buildings. It was safer and healthier, and all of that stuff. But did it go far enough? We thought it still looked a bit like a street, just without the cars. So how could we push it further? So we looked to the park, which really offered the solution, and having made the park a safer place, more of the urban oasis that we'd always envisaged, we were then able to capitalise on this value and extend the park further out to meet the buildings. So the park lost its straight edge, it became more organic, more natural, and Ash Avenue had lost its corporateness. We then thought about how it would feel to dine in the park, not merely on the edge of the park, and that got the team quite excited. It's hard to imagine when you stand there today, cars and vans whizzing by. The other thing to point out is that as well as delivering a bigger park and a better retail experience, we actually reduced the cost of the landscape overall by moving away from conventional road design with curbs and drainage gullies and hard granite paving. And the planting on the edge of the park also now doubles up as a rain garden. So this was a pivotal moment for us, and it gave the team license to really start interrogating the rest of the master plan to see if we could, without compromising safety and ability to maintain buildings, remove the need for cars and delivery vehicles elsewhere. We also looked at how we could make the streets greener to reduce air pollution, soak up surface water runoff, promote biodiversity, and make it a more inviting space for people to be in. We're really starting to embrace this whole business of putting people and nature first, and as you can see it in action today when you take a walk through the park and the surrounding streets. People are hanging out, they're making connections, people are choosing to live, work and relax in these public spaces that we've now created. Not rocket science, really. Just staying with the park for a minute, as the park grew and we removed the road, we decided to shift our main play hub closer to Ash Avenue and the retail offer. At the same time shifted to a strategy of providing natural play. So this is Elephant Springs, 400 tonnes of porphyry stone with jets, cascades, stream beds and hand pumps. And surprise, surprise, when you give children the opportunity to manipulate their environment, they stay interested for longer, and their mum and dad stay longer, and that's great for bringing life to public spaces. Makes them feel safer also, as well as supporting the local business. 80% of the feature is fully accessible. You can bring wheelchairs, buggies, motorised scooters into the water, and we've also won a ROSPA Safety Award for our efforts. Here are some of our happiest and most satisfied customers at Elephant Park. The other example I'd like to talk about is the Pavilion. So the brief for the Park Pavilion has changed 3 or 4 times, at least since the start of the project. Under outline planning, Lendlease had permission to build a 2-storey glass and steel box with a restaurant on the edge of the park near Castle Square. And as we moved to more detailed design, we quickly realised we didn't want a corporate-looking glass box on the edge of the park. We looked at building a cafe in the park, and then we asked ourselves the question, well, actually, how do we create a building where people would feel welcome, even if they weren't in a position to buy something? What if you didn't have a lot of money to last to the end of the week, but you still wanted to take the kids to the park for some fun? So the idea of a more versatile and democratic building came about. The idea was to create a landscape building, an extension of the public realm. The idea of a multifunctional public building that served the needs of the community developed. One where you could get great views of the park, feel like you were in the canopy of the trees, and connect with nature. We also thought it should house all of our back-of-house public realm systems, the irrigation, water controls, etc., avoiding the all too familiar and unsightly feeder pillars that often pop up in the public realm. So here it is, the treehouse with its bookable space, kiosk cafe, public toilets, and of course the viewing deck, which is wrapped around one of the beautiful mature London plane trees, an extension of the public realm that's completely free to use. You can hang out there all day and not have to spend any money. The internal courtyard provides access to the bookable space, as well as providing a main route through the park. Again, this little building that's only been open for a few weeks is already becoming an important stopping off point for people. A place for refreshment, a place for events, a place to relax, watch people and take part in park life. It's important to mention that people have been central to all of these decisions that we've made. We did a lot of listening to our stakeholders, particularly the existing community, and of course increasingly the new residents at Elephant Park. We rolled out a series of public space workshops in the surrounding residential areas. We presented the evolving landscape and pavilion designs back to residents at local meetings. Overwhelmingly, people said they wanted contact with nature. They wanted to feel safe day and night, and they wanted to have fun. We really think that we started to understand the needs of the local community better when we put ourselves in the shoes of those people and started to imagine the day in the life of someone on their way to or from school, a mother or father taking their child to play in the park. Most of us can't imagine a city without the sound of birdsong, the buzzing of bees and other pollinating insects, the hum of life that provides a connection to the natural world. We know from an ever-growing body of research that healthy cities are also cities that are buzzing with wildlife. Biodiversity at Elephant Park has been considered right the way through the design. We have species-rich lawns in the park, which are great for wildlife as well as humans. Plant species, all the plant species have been reviewed by ecologists. We have log piles, bug hotels, even a stag beetle stumpery, and bird and bat boxes, of course, in most of the trees. The structure of the planting is important too, lots of varying heights of trees and shrubs to create a feeling of being in a woodland glade, which at the same time is so important for nesting birds and other wildlife. Lendlease has been working closely with Centric Lab, who are neuroscientists, and we'll be launching our Nature, Cities and Health report, setting out a new agenda for intelligent biodiversity that supports human biological functions and the building of social capital and equity in nature-based environments. As a company, we're not keeping this stuff to ourselves. We want to share it with the world's developers and built environment professionals. I'll finish with a summary of some of the big changes that we've made around the master plan. I'm not going to speak to all of these, but of course, sitting right in the centre of this plan is the park. And you can see how it's growing out in all directions to create value, extending the green tentacles of green infrastructure down every street, removing cars where they don't need to be there, increasing biodiversity and making a place for people and nature. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ewan. And now I'd like to invite Harriet, Steve, David, Sarah and Ewan to join me for the panel Q&A. We've got all sorts of questions coming in. I'm going to kick off with questions for Harriet. There's a clutch of questions, Harriet, about your Cambridge scheme with Procter Matthews. The first one is, can you remind us of the name of the project? So we'll start with that. And then people are very curious about how you have managed the pedestrian and cyclist zones. There's all sorts of questions. I'll run through a few of them because I think they interrelate. So one is, what about speed limits? One's, how can pedestrians be protected from cyclists? Do you request that people demount their bikes in certain areas? And finally, how do you handle emergency access?
The project's called Abode, and the whole development is called Great Knighton. Cyclists, they're all shared surfaces. The roads were designed to keep road traffic under 10 to 15 miles an hour. So we did that by not only having very, very narrow carriageways, but also they were made even narrower through building out the building up planting adjacent to the pavement, so between the pavement and the road, which formed in some cases rain gardens, which helped with the water attenuation throughout the site. What were the other questions? Oh, how do we set up the pedestrian route? We used that with materials, so we had basically a very as simple a palette of materials as we could possibly have, which would be acceptable to Cambridge highways because the roads were adoptable. So therefore we used a kind of beige colour which ran east to west across the site, which was the pedestrian route. So where that ran across the road, there was a change in road colour, and there were raised tables at those points. So basically it naturally, and also the road was narrowed even further. So basically the traffic was slowly had to slow down even more when it came to a pedestrian crossing, so that it would so that people could pass safely. And I think there was something about cyclist dismounting.
Yes. Do you request that people demount their bike in certain areas?
Yeah, no, they could cycle wherever they wanted. It was shared, but there was some roads which were shared between cycles, cars, and pedestrians, and they were the very, very narrow roads where it was designed to be shared. So therefore, nobody dismounted. Everybody travelled in their own mode of transport, and they were kind of designed in a way that they were safe.
Picking up specifically on your very good highway engineer, I think a lot of us, including me, would very much like their name. Somebody's asking, how much are we at the mercy of highways engineers?
Very, very, very much, and it depends where you're working. You know, I've worked with some highway authorities where they insist on a 6-metre carriageway on a residential road, which is just complete madness. It means the traffic goes fast. It means you've got no room for trees. It means you've got no room for sustainable urban drainage. It just puts the emphasis completely on the wrong thing. And the guy from Cambridge has now left, and I've completely forgotten his name. And it was 10 years ago that we were all, and it was completed 6 years ago, but obviously it went into planning, 10 years, what was it? 2009, I think we went to planning with that one. So yeah, we are completely at their mercy. And it's kind of key to getting them alongside initially, and also having good transport engineers on your team that can then talk their language, because they kind of see us as the landscape architects and the architects as a bit fluffy and a bit kind of, oh, you don't know what you know, and they come back at you with that it's a safety issue, which, I mean, obviously we would never want to design something that isn't safe, but it's very difficult to argue against that when you've got the expert at the highway saying, I can't do that because it's unsafe. So whatever you say, however much evidence you've got from other places, but if you have a good highway engineer on your team, then it's much easier to argue.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Steve because we've got a lot of questions to get through. So, Steve, you seem to have prompted general horror, really, at how shocking the UK's record is on biodiversity. So fundamentally, do you think the targets and plans we have are fit for purpose? And do we need to have tighter legislation?
Those are really good questions. Do I think the plans that we have in place are fit for purpose? I think they're moving in the right direction. It's fair to put what's happening now in the context of we haven't done a huge amount over the past couple of decades. So the plans and processes that we have in place now, while ecologists would like those to go further, I think we recognise that they're a step in the right direction. Yes, legislation absolutely does need to be tightened, but more importantly than the legislation being tightened, its implementation and planning policy needs to be tightened. That's probably one of the biggest frustrations for ecologists working in design projects, that quite often design teams or planners will deprioritise ecology for other reasons. That's how we got to a biodiversity crisis. So yes, legislation could be improved, but its implementation, particularly through policy, is much more important.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question here about biodiversity net gain. Somebody's asking, how does this concept reconcile with vast rural greenfield developments such as Otterpool Park, Garden Town, or similar 150-unit developments? So, Steve, what's your response to that?
It's a really good question, and this is one of the biggest debates in BNG. We've got to recognise BNG is still new. There's lots of criticism of it. This is why I spoke about using it genuinely within the spirit of its purpose. We know that it's easier, far easier to achieve biodiversity net gain on greenfield sites than it is on smaller urban sites. And sometimes it's the complete opposite. It depends entirely on your metric, and we do not have the flexibility of the metric to apply professional judgment to that, which is always going to be a challenge. That's always going to be an issue. There are, obviously, we're now at version 3.1 of the metric. I expect once we implement this in November next year, bearing in mind it's being used extensively at the minute, there will be further changes to reflect some of those very particular challenges in fairness. We already have a small site BNG metric, which is a much simplified version of the metric for much smaller developments. And I think we'll see a move towards differentiation in how the metric is used across different types of landscapes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on now to David. David, we've got a clutch of questions coming in asking really about how MTX compares with MDF. So first of all, at a very basic level, does it come in the same sheet sizes and thicknesses as standard MDF? And moving on from that, how does it compare cost-wise?
Well, the first one, yes. I mean, sheet sizes are pretty similar. It comes in a range of thicknesses from 4 up to 18 millimeters. In your normal 8x4, so 2440 by 1220, we do a 10-foot panel as well, 3050 in the higher thicknesses. I think it's 12, 15, and 18 mil. So yeah, and it's available, nationwide in all of our core markets through our distribution partners. Sizes. The second question was cost. It's expensive. It's about maybe 4 or 5 times more expensive than normal MDF, but as you saw in the pictures, it doesn't behave like MDF. Apart from looking like MDF, it doesn't do any of the other things that MDF would do in terms of rotting and degradation and moisture and dimensional stability and so on. So it's a completely unrelated and non-comparable product, really, as opposed, apart from purely the aesthetics of it. And if you compare it to the price of a sheet of marine plywood, I mean, don't get me started on marine plywood, but properly, fully certified 1088 marine plywood is not what people think it is and expect it is in the marketplace. There are some very good sources of true marine plywood, but as you saw in one of the photographs, Manx Railway, that was marine plywood, and it does eventually rot away. So to find a very good, truly certified marine plywood now is difficult. And it's about comparable with that.
Okay, thank you. And David, can you tell us a bit about how MTX performs with regard to fire protection? What's the fire classification, and is there any certification available?
Yeah, well, first of all, it is not really designated to be a fire-resistant board. We do have products for that. So we've flame retardant MDF and OSBs. So the European classification for MTX is Euroclass E. We have full certification and CE marking in accordance with that. Really, this question comes up an awful lot: is what is the fire classification? Particularly when it's used in cladding and things like that. So, what I will say about that is it's a very complicated question. I did see one question pop up about in relation to Grenfell. Now, obviously, that means Grenfell is as a result of high-rise buildings. So MTX is not really intended for high-rise buildings. In fact, none of our products are intended for high-rise buildings. All of our OSB, MDF, and MTX products are for low and medium-rise buildings below 18 meters, which obviously the fire resistance performance is a lot less onerous than it is, obviously for the right reasons, for high-rise buildings. So really, it's all to do with the appropriate use of materials for the design. So as you saw in all of the examples that I gave, apart from the cladding ones, none of those would have any expectation of fire resistance because they're all outdoor products and very low fire risk. In the couple of examples like the beach huts and things like that, where it is used as a cladding product, obviously there's very low risk there. It's on a beach side, and fire resistance is all about safe escape in a period of time. So it takes seconds to walk out of that building, whereas it takes up to an hour to get out of a high-rise building. So it's all in context. And obviously there are different regulations between England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, and the Netherlands as well. So we all have our own regulations, and that is changing. But to summarize, MTX is not really for those high-rise applications. It has plenty of opportunities that don't need fire resistance.
Okay, thank you very much. Very comprehensive answer. David, I've got one more question for you, which is, other than being formaldehyde-free, what chemicals does MTX contain, and is it produced to be part of the circular economy?
Well, great question. Yeah, it's the resin we use is a product called MDI, which is essentially a polyurethane. So it's really the same resin that's used in your car dashboard and your running shoes and things like that. So that's why the product is formaldehyde free, or no added formaldehyde, as we say. The resin doesn't add any formaldehyde to the product. In terms of any other chemicals in there, the acetylation process that I mentioned is a completely non-toxic and safe process. It is literally vinegar, so it's aceted. It's derived from acetic anhydride, so it's basically an acetic acid, which, if you know from your vinegar, it literally is a vinegar in its very dilute form. So in the product, there is a very, very small concentration of that residual vinegar in the product. And if you smell MTX, you can actually smell that vinegar, which is why the termites don't like it and the bugs don't like it, really. And that's the only thing. So that is completely non-toxic. We have done huge amounts of testing globally on the product in terms of its toxicity to aquatic and plant life and things like that. So even in ground, if it eventually does come out, it's biodegradable. And there's no issue with plant life or aquatic life.
Great, thank you very much for that. Moving on now to Sarah, we've got various questions coming in about your grotto. So the first one is, how did you manage to create the mature planted cliff face appearance?
Well, tricks of the trade, it's all smoke and mirrors, but essentially, we designed the crevices so that they could accommodate a certain size of container for the plant, so 1 and 2 litre plants. So that was all designed in with Alex, and we practiced that. For a longer term application, you would have irrigation in there. Because our exhibit only lasts a week at Chelsea, we did not do that, but there are many applications that you can use to provide that that irrigation system. Although it depends on the repose of the face and the plants you use. We went for very much a damp woodland scenario. So in those circumstances, once established, the plants would be able to survive. So it is all dependent on the plants that you select. And the circumstances of the site and the habitat, etc.
Okay, and Sarah, we have somebody asking specifically, what's the finish on the MTX grotto that gives that rusty steel look?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew. These artists aren't very good at giving away their secrets, I have to say. But essentially, it was a mixture. So there were paint finishes, and then there were finishes where there were iron filings added, essentially, as washes in various formats to the surfaces. So the actual oxidization, if you like, does come from an iron content, and so it developed over time. So some of it was done pre-show, in other words, before we started on site, which is a 3-week construction period, and some of it was then either finished off, any damaged sections through construction, were finished off, or if we decided we needed more depth in areas, we actually did that on site. So it was quite complex, but it was quite fun. It was nothing, although they like to hide their secrets, it actually was quite a simple process if you understand your coatings.
Okay, and so I'm going to ask you this question. I don't know if you'll know the answer. If not, we might try David, but I'll give it to you first. So what type of glue do you use for the smart ply when you use it underground or in contact with water or soil?
Okay, well, we didn't use glue per se, so I think I'm going to hand that over to David.
Okay, David, do you want to
is the question
and...
glue is the question glue in the panel or glue to
well,
glue
that's
pieces
good.
together?
It doesn't clarify. The actual question is, what type of glue do you use for the smart ply when you use it underground or in contact with water or soil?
Okay. Well, the first correction there is never ever use smart ply underground. It's the MEDITE Tricoya Extreme. That's the product we're talking about here. Smart ply OSB is for service class 2 only, which is moisture resistant but not for use outside. So the glue again we use the same glue in MTX as we do in all of our smart ply products, which is Formaldehyde-Free, which is the MDI resin I spoke about. And again, that gives its main reason for that is its high moisture resistance. In terms, if the question is related to gluing pieces together along a piece of string, there's lots of glues out there in the marketplace, but typically we would recommend a D4. So D4 is an exterior glue, so not your normal D2 or D3 internal glues. It has to be an exterior one. There are different types of PU polyurethanes, even PVA water-based glues like that as well. But I'm not an expert in glues, so read the manufacturers. We do provide guidance for that if that person wanted to contact our technical department on that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to Ewan, because lots of people are very interested in Elephant Park. First of all, Ewan, somebody's saying getting rid of the road is inspired thinking. How did you win over the naysayers, and have there been any negative repercussions?
So yeah, plenty of naysayers in the process. I remember at the time having discussions with various consultants and stakeholders, and people were concerned about the lack of footfall to the retail offer and so on because of lack of car access. Even people suggesting that it might be a less safe street because cars bring activation and natural surveillance, which is quite interesting when you think about the safety issues of children running out onto roads and so on. And of course, at TfL, although they weren't naysayers, they were obviously concerned about the safety of TfL, how that was going to of New Kent Road and how that was going to work with buses, and etc. Needed some convincing that we could create this sort of safe junction. So I think probably the secret to convincing naysayers was really to turn the question on its head and say, well, how do we create the best environment we can for people? And when you start doing that and start thinking about this through the lens of customers, so that's everybody and anyone who passes through these spaces, then overwhelmingly a green traffic-free street is definitely going to be the best approach. So I'd also say collaboration as well was absolutely key. So our partners within the Regen team at Southwark were absolutely brilliant at helping us to have those discussions. And of course, when you go out and ask people in the community what they'd prefer, the answer is overwhelmingly a safe street without cars whizzing up and down. And in terms of how it's operating now, I mean, I would invite anyone to go to Elephant Park and walk down Ash Avenue and just see the amount of footfall that we've got there and the amount of people sitting outside restaurants and cafes and so on and enjoying that connection with the park. And of course, we've got the big play area opposite, and there's a sort of natural relationship between sort of the retail offer and the F&B offer and kids playing just over the way quite safely.
And on the subject of the kids, sorry, on that subject, we've got a question from somebody who says they love the Elephant Stream's water feature. What were your main considerations when designing and siting, and how is it weathering?
Okay, so I mean, overwhelmingly, the key principle was to create fun and delight for people. So rather than going into the design process, first and foremost thinking about safety, which of course is very important, thinking about how much fun, delight can we create, how much play value can we create here. We brought in some play consultants early on in the process who advised us that natural play was the way we needed to go. So rather than pulling stuff out of a catalogue, I suppose, and arranging them in a play area, which is generally those sorts of features are centred around climbing and sliding and sort of the conventional idea of a play area. So the idea that we could create something that children can manipulate themselves was quite key to that. And I think what we found is that actually if you create an environment like that, children stay longer. People hang around longer around those sorts of spaces. In fact, we've heard people sort of spending half a day there. Families will just camp out there and use it as a hub. And the other key thing is that the play area, a key principle was that it was woven into the landscape, that it didn't just feel like a play area. That it is actually, you'll notice on some of the images there, the planting is actually brought right into the feature. And when there aren't lots of children clambering on it, for all intents and purposes, it just looks like part of the landscape. So I think that was key. Multi-generational as well, so not sticking religiously to the sort of 0 to 5.
We are out of time, but
sure.
I would say if we haven't got around to your question, it's brilliant to have so many questions. Please do email us and we will get back to you as soon as we can. We're going to be emailing everybody who's registered with a recording of all of the presentations. And now I would like to thank our panellists who have all been fantastic. So Harriet Bourne, Steve Jackson-Matthews, Sarah Eberly, David Murray and Ewan Oliver. And thank you to our programme partner, MEDITE SmartPly, and thank you all for listening.